In 1955, a handful of United States senators sat down, blindfolded, to settle a small mystery. Could they actually taste the difference between real butter and its cheap imitation? Most could. One couldn't. And he happened to be the imitation's loudest critic in the room. That imitation was margarine. And for the better part of a century, in large parts of the United States, it was illegal to sell it looking anything like the product it was trying to replace. Not because it was unsafe, because it looked too much like butter. This is the story of how a food substitute became one of the strangest targets in American legal history. Dragged into court, taxed like a vice, and in some states, legally required to be dyed pink. Margarine's origin has nothing to do with America at all. It begins in France in 1869 with Emperor Napoleon III. Facing butter shortages and the cost of feeding both an army and a struggling working class, Napoleon offered a prize to anyone who could invent a cheap, long-lasting butter substitute. A French chemist named Hippolyte Mege took the challenge. He found a way to churn beef tallow with milk into something that looked more or less like butter. He patented the process in July 1869 and called it oleomargarine. He won Napoleon's prize, and little else. The product barely sold in France, and Mege died in relative poverty just over a decade later. His invention found its future elsewhere. In 1871, a Dutch company bought his process, refined it, and began building what would become an international margarine industry, a company that would, decades later, become part of what is today Unilever. Margarine crossed the Atlantic quickly. Mege process was granted a U.S. patent as early as 1873. And it terrified the American dairy industry. Butter was one of the country's most valuable farm products, and here was a cheaper competitor made largely from beef fat, not milk. Dairy farmers didn't see a rival snack. They saw an existential threat. They fought back through legislation, state by state, well before Washington got involved. As early as 1877, states began restricting how margarine could be sold and labeled. New York and New Jersey were among the first movers. By the mid-1880s, dozens of states already had some form of margarine law on the books, several banning it outright. Then the pressure reached Congress. On July 23, 1886, lawmakers passed the Oleomargarine Act, and 10 days later, President Grover Cleveland signed it into law. It required an expensive federal license to manufacture or sell margarine, plus a tax of 2 cents a pound, roughly 60 cents in today's money, whether the margarine was colored or not. The federal tax alone didn't kill the product, so the fight moved to a stranger battlefield. Color. Margarine, made industrially, comes out pale and white, closer to lard than to anything you'd want on toast. Manufacturers quickly discovered that dyeing it a warm, buttery yellow made people buy far more of it. To the dairy industry, that wasn't clever marketing, it was fraud dressed up as convenience. State by state, lawmakers passed what were called anti-color laws, banning yellow margarine outright. By the early 1900s, more than 30 states had some version of this rule on the books, and the rhetoric got dramatic. Minnesota's governor, Lucius Hubbard, denounced it as the product of depraved human genius. A handful of states went even further. Vermont, in 1884, followed later by New Hampshire and South Dakota, passed laws requiring margarine to be dyed pink, an unmistakably artificial color no one could confuse for butter. That's exactly what got a Swift & Company sales agent named Collins arrested in Manchester, New Hampshire, in 1898 for selling margarine that wasn't pink. He was convicted and fined. His case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. In Collins versus New Hampshire, the justices didn't just strike down his fine, they struck down the entire premise. Forcing a legal, edible product to be dyed an unappetizing color, the court found, was really just banning it by another means. As the justices put it, the law was designed to create repugnance up to the point of a positive and absolute refusal to purchase the product at all. The pink laws were dead. The yellow bans were not. The dairy lobby didn't give up. In 1902, it pushed Congress to amend the Oleomargarine Act again, this time hitting colored margarine with a steep new tax of 10 cents a pound, more than $3 today, while dropping the tax on plain white margarine to 1/4 cent. Colored margarine had effectively been taxed out of existence. Manufacturers found a workaround anyway. If they weren't allowed to sell margarine already colored yellow, they'd let the customer do it instead. Tubs of white margarine started shipping with a small capsule or packet of yellow food dye tucked inside. At home, families would knead the color through the margarine by hand until it looked enough like butter to spread on toast. It became a routine kitchen chore for millions of Americans, one that lasted, in various forms, into the 1940s. The product itself was quietly changing, too. Manufacturers gradually shifted their recipes from animal fats toward hydrogenated vegetable oils, making margarine cheaper, more consistent, and easier to improve, all while dairy state legislatures kept fighting over what color it was legally allowed to be. What finally broke the laws wasn't a court ruling. It was butter itself. Through the Second World War and into the post-war years, butter prices climbed and supply tightened, while margarine stayed cheap and increasingly hard to tell apart from the real thing. Public opinion shifted. In 1950, Congress repealed the Oleomargarine Act entirely, ending federal restrictions 64 years after they began. States were slower to let go. In 1955, a group of Wisconsin state senators, proud representatives of America's leading dairy state, agreed to a blind taste test between butter and margarine. Most correctly identified the butter. One of the most outspokenly pro-butter senators in the room, Gordon Rosalip, did not. He confidently picked the margarine, insisting it was real butter. It later came out that his own wife, worried about his heart, had quietly been serving him illegal yellow margarine at their dinner table for years. None of this stopped ordinary Wisconsinites from getting what they wanted. Because the state kept its color ban long after most of its neighbors dropped theirs, residents began making what they called oleo runs, regular drives across the state line into Illinois or Minnesota to legally buy colored margarine and haul it home. Accounts from the era describe drivers making the 100-mile round trip, paying cash at roadside stands just over the border, then easing back across the state line at a careful, unhurried pace, wary of being pulled over. By the mid-1960s, gas stations near the Illinois border were reportedly selling as much as a ton of margarine a week to Wisconsin shoppers. Smugglers technically faced fines running into the thousands of dollars. In practice, the law was rarely enforced against them. By 1959, margarine had gone fully mainstream, respectable enough that former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt appeared in a television commercial for Good Luck Margarine, telling viewers she had it on her toast every morning and had thoroughly enjoyed it. The brand's parent company, Lever Brothers, would later merge with the very same Dutch margarine business built from Mejmouriez's original patent, forming what is now Unilever. State by state, the remaining color laws finally fell. Minnesota and Wisconsin were the last two holdouts, both repealing their bans on yellow margarine in 1967, 81 years after Congress first taxed the product as a threat to the American table. Remarkably, one fragment of the old rule never went away. Wisconsin law still restricts serving colored margarine in place of butter at restaurants, unless a customer specifically asks for it. Strip away the strangeness, and the story of margarine's color laws isn't really about food safety at all. Nothing about yellow dye made margarine dangerous to eat. What it threatened was a powerful industry's bottom line. And for the better part of a century, American law was written to protect that industry's product, not the people buying it. Margarine ultimately won not because a court freed it, but because economics did. By the 1970s, Americans were eating roughly 10 pounds of it a year, most of them never once considering that the tub in their fridge had, within living memory, been the subject of Supreme Court rulings, federal taxes, and prison sentences. All over a color. It's worth remembering the next time a new product gets banned, taxed, or restricted in the name of protecting consumers. Sometimes that's exactly what's happening. And sometimes, as it was for nearly a century of American butter dishes, it's simply the sound of an old industry protecting itself.